All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know we always love getting your source suggestions. And this time, you guys really threw us curveball with this one.
I know, right?
Ellul's propaganda.
Yeah. Heavy stuff.
And I think when most people hear propaganda, you think like, oh, it's just about like changing my opinion, right? But these sources, from what I've been reading, they're suggesting something a lot deeper is going on. Something maybe even, well, a little unsettling, to be honest.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to really unpack these ideas you've shared and see if we can make sense of the inner workings of propaganda. Like, what's it really aiming for? How does it actually work? And what kind of impact does it have on us and on society?
Yeah. And what I think is so fascinating about Ellul's is that he gives us this whole framework that goes way beyond just simple persuasion.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at some really important distinctions he makes, like between, propaganda that's meant to agitate, to stir things up, versus propaganda that's meant to integrate us into a system. We're also going to be digging into the very close relationship between propaganda and mass media and technology. And I think, one of the big takeaways is going to be how we as individuals relate to this powerful force, this really powerful force in the modern world. I think you might even come away looking at the information around you a little bit differently.
Oh, I hope I do. So I'm already taking notes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump right in. This first idea that really struck me was that, we think of propaganda as getting you to agree with something, but Ellul is saying that might just be a side effect. What it's really about is something different. It's like amplifying existing feelings, really focusing those views, and then most importantly, I think, pushing us towards action, or sometimes even preventing us from acting. So it's really about behavior.
Yeah. What's really clever is Ellul actually uses this word propagandas, plural, like to really underline just how many different forms and functions it has. And one of the most, I think, basic distinctions he makes is between what he calls agitation propaganda and integration propaganda.
Okay.
So agitation propaganda, the way he describes it, it's about taking those existing feelings of resentment, frustration, and then, channeling them into this desire for rebellion. It's about igniting social unrest.
Oh, so it's like you're taking that low-level hum of, dissatisfaction and you're turning it up to 11. It's like, maybe the kind of propaganda you'd see in the lead up to, like a huge social upheaval. It's like getting people out on the streets demanding change.
Precisely. It feeds on, strong, often negative emotions. Yeah, integration propaganda, that's a whole different ballgame. This is about getting individuals to adjust to a certain way of doing things, to conform to a particular way that the society is structured. And, Ellul actually makes the argument that this kind of propaganda, it's absolutely essential for a technological society to even function properly.
Really? So integration. So it's
Yeah.
like more about getting everyone to just buy into the status quo.
Yeah.
To just accept the way things are, basically. And he ties this directly to technology and mass media.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like mass media, just by its nature, the fact that it can reach so many people with a really unified, consistent message makes it the perfect vehicle for spreading this type of integration propaganda. It's less about that sudden burst of, intense emotion and more about this constant pervasive influence that kind of just shapes how you see the world and your place in it.
Okay, so propaganda isn't just a tool that can be used. Ellul's even bolder. He's saying that it's actually a necessary condition for, technical progress, for a technological civilization. Like, how does he even get there?
Well, he sees propaganda as operating under what he calls the law of efficiency, just like any other technique. So for a really complex, technologically driven society to advance, you need a certain level of, societal organization, a certain set of shared values. And propaganda, particularly that integration kind, it plays a key role in creating that kind of social glue.
So almost like it's the thing that holds together, a complex, technologically advanced society by making sure enough people are on board with the general direction.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. But he also raises a really important point right at the beginning of his analysis. He says that studying propaganda objectively, it's incredibly difficult because we all have our own moral and political baggage, right? We tend to immediately label it as this evil thing.
Yeah, I mean, makes sense, given its history of, manipulation, spreading falsehoods. So he's basically saying we need to kind of set those feelings aside, at least for a bit, if we want to really see how it works, regardless of how we feel about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He wants us to kind of focus on the phenomenon itself, analyze its mechanisms, its effectiveness, before we start applying our ethical judgments, because that's how we get a really clear and objective understanding of how it operates.
And one thing that really surprised me, It's just how broad his definition of propaganda is. Like, it's not just political speeches or slogans. He's including things like psychological action, which sounds really broad. Psychological warfare. Okay, that makes sense. And then even re-education and public and human relations. Like, how does that even fit in?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So psychological action is basically any attempt to modify opinions using psychological means. Often it's got some educational element to it, and it's targeted at the general population. Then you've got psychological warfare, which we all kind of know, that's aimed at demoralizing the enemy. Re-education and brainwashing, that's more intense, used on captive populations. But you're right, public and human relations, that seems a bit strange.
It does.
But Ellul's argument is that any activity that's trying to adapt individuals to a certain society, a certain standard of living, certain ways of behaving, anything that encourages conformity, that all falls under his definition of propaganda.
Oh, okay. So like a public relations campaign to make a corporation look good. Or, I don't know, like HR programs to, try to make a workplace more harmonious, that kind of thing.
Exactly. He sees it all as attempts to kind of adjust individuals to fit a certain mold within a system.
Right. So it's about making the system run smoother by influencing how people see it and, how they fit within it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we got this really broad definition. Now, Ellul also talks about how propagandists often try to claim that they're using science, like psychology, sociology, but those claims are often dismissed.
Yeah, what's fascinating is that he gives specific examples of how propaganda actually draws on established psychological theories. So he points out that Stalinist propaganda was really influenced by Pavlov's work on conditioned reflexes.
The whole like associating a certain signal with like a desired automatic response, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And then he goes on to mention how Hitlerian propaganda drew from Freud's ideas about repression and libido. So tapping into those kind of deep-seated unconscious desires and anxieties, and he even connects American propaganda to the educational theories of, John Dewey.
Dewey, the educational reformer, like...
Well, think about Dewey's emphasis on active learning and shaping behavior through experience.
Yeah.
Ellul suggests that American propaganda subtly guides people towards certain conclusions through these carefully constructed narratives.
Right.
And by selectively presenting information, it's about shaping understanding through kind of a guided experience.
So when those psychologists or sociologists, when they kind of dismiss propaganda as unscientific, Ellul's point is maybe they're actually rejecting the underlying psychological theories that those propagandists are using. If you don't accept the validity of, conditioned reflexes, then propaganda based on those principles is going to seem pseudoscientific.
Exactly. It's not necessarily about the absolute scientific truth, in a kind of academic sense, but rather about its power to influence people, to change their thoughts, their actions.
So moving on, this leads us to how propaganda views the individual. And it's not exactly a very flattering picture, right?
Right. No, not at all.
It's about reducing us to our common characteristics, our common motivations, common feelings, rather than seeing our unique individuality.
Right. It doesn't target the individual in all their complexity. It focuses on what makes them similar to others, basically reduces them to an average. Because, for large numbers of people, appealing to those common denominators will be effective in getting a desired response.
And the individual is almost always seen as part of this mass, something that needs to be integrated into a larger whole. Why is this integration into the mass so crucial for propaganda to really work?
Well, because within a mass, our individual psychological defenses, they tend to weaken. Emotions become more contagious. There's this pressure to conform to the prevailing feeling. Think about being in a huge crowd. You might find yourself like feeling and acting in ways that you wouldn't if you were alone. Propaganda, it really skillfully exploits that whole dynamic.
So even something like listening to the radio, which feels very solitary, becomes a mass experience in this context because, you're aware that there are countless other people out there listening to that same message, potentially having, those same thoughts and feelings triggered.
Absolutely. Ellul talks about, radio listeners exhibiting a mass mentality, even when they're alone in their homes. And he even extends that to like direct personal contact, like someone going door to door campaigning.
Oh, yeah.
Even though it feels like this one-on-one interaction, the person at the door, they represent a larger organization. And the individual, they're seen as just one part of this, like invisible crowd of targets.
Like, you're not just talking to that single person, but you're interacting with like an extension of a whole movement or organization. And Ellul really hones in on this state of being isolated within a mass as being super favorable for propaganda to be effective. And it's a condition that's made even worse, I guess you could say, by mass media. That's pretty unsettling when you think about it.
It is, because in that state, individuals are, on the one hand, disconnected from those strong, immediate, like, social bonds.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they're constantly being exposed to this consistent, unified message from the mass media. And, that kind of lack of a direct social counterweight, it makes them more susceptible to influence. And he even points out that if you deliberately fragment existing social groups, psychologically, that makes them even more vulnerable to, really total propaganda action. So it's like a divide and conquer, but on a mental level.
So we've seen how propaganda targets individuals within a mass, but let's look at just how pervasive propaganda can be. Like, it's not limited to just the obvious channels, right? Ellul points out how seemingly unrelated things can be co-opted and, used for propaganda.
Yeah, for sure. He gives some really interesting examples. He talks about things like education methods, being kind of twisted to be used for political indoctrination, even the release of prisoners, but these are prisoners that have already been, indoctrinated, and offering care for enemy wounded being used as propaganda to project an image of goodwill. He even quotes Mao Zedong saying something like, everything can be a vehicle for propaganda. Everything must be utilized. It's a really totalizing view.
Wow. Talk about saturation. And then he brings up this idea of pre-propaganda, or he calls it sociological propaganda. It sounds like an even subtler long-term form of influence.
It is. It's a lot more gradual, less direct. It's basically an effort to cultivate the right kind of underlying climate in the population, to establish certain preliminary attitudes before you even hit them with any kind of direct propaganda.
Okay. So it's not about immediately trying to change someone's mind on an issue, but about setting the stage so they're more likely to accept those ideas later on.
Exactly. He uses this really great analogy. He says sociological propaganda is like plowing a field, creating that fertile soil. While direct propaganda, that's the sowing of the seeds, planting those specific messages, you often need both for a really successful harvest. So sociological propaganda, it works by creating ambiguities in existing beliefs, subtly reducing prejudice, spreading certain images, ideas, but seemingly without a specific immediate purpose.
Like those examples he mentions of like films on French infrastructure.
Right.
They're not explicitly saying France is powerful, but they're subtly building a positive image, a sense of national pride that can be drawn upon later.
Exactly. It's about building a foundation, a general sentiment, a positive association, that you can then leverage with the more direct forms of propaganda when the need arises. And, he emphasizes that propaganda the word, so what is actually said, and propaganda the deed. So what is done, they're really deeply connected. They're complementary. So talk needs, tangible action to back it up.
Right.
Make it credible. And actions need explanation, need framing in order to be interpreted in the way that you want.
So a leader giving a powerful speech needs to be able to point to, some kind of event or policy. And that event then needs to be interpreted through the lens of the propaganda to make it stick.
Exactly. And he really highlights the sheer power of continuous propaganda. The constant repetition, and just overwhelms our ability to resist. And that relentlessness is one of the reasons why propaganda can get away with these sudden shifts in messaging, seemingly contradictory stuff.
Because people are just so caught up in the flow of information that they just go along with it. Maybe to avoid that discomfort of like breaking from their established way of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of chilling when you think about it.
Yeah. Now, Ellul raises a really interesting point about like statements from democracies versus those from more authoritarian governments. And he says they don't always have the same impact.
Right.
Like, why do you think that is?
Well, he seems to be suggesting that it comes down to whether there's like an internal organization, like boots on the ground, that can really amplify the message. So, democracies making statements from afar might not have that built-in apparatus to translate those words into, a real movement.
Yeah, that's a great insight. And he contrasts like the muted reaction when, France and England criticized elections in, Syria and Egypt with the huge impact when Nasser, he launches his own propaganda campaign on this similar theme. But it was about elections in Iraq.
So Nasser had that like existing network of supporters that could actually turn those words into action. So it wasn't just this abstract criticism, it was backed up by a visible movement.
Exactly. It becomes more than just words. It's a visible fact, on the ground,
Mhm.
and that gives it a lot of strength and credibility.
And then Ellul draws this really interesting parallel between how we kind of compartmentalize our own lives, like, being super autonomous in our personal time, but then conforming to, the rules and expectations at work.
Hmm.
And he's saying that's kind of how propaganda operates on us as individuals.
Yeah, it's not necessarily aiming to erase your personal thoughts or beliefs across the board,
All right.
but it might be focusing on channeling your political and social actions.
Right. So it's not about making you believe every single thing, but just getting you to act in those desired ways,
Yes.
even if there's like a disconnect.
Hmm. And he makes this point that it seeks to create, proselytes, militants, those are the active followers. Not necessarily like wise and deeply thoughtful individuals.
Oh, yeah. And then there's this really interesting idea of political education lining up with what Goebbels called sub-propaganda or basic propaganda.
Yeah.
It's not about objective learning. It's about actually creating a whole new worldview.
Yeah, it's not about presenting like unbiased information.
Mm-hmm.
It's about creating a whole system of unchallenged presuppositions, really ingrained stereotypes. It's about shaping how people perceive reality.
So it's not just giving them the information, it's giving them the framework for how to even understand that information.
Hmm.
And he notes this shift in the Soviet Union's approach, where they moved away from seeing like ideological indoctrination as the end goal. And instead they started using it as a tool for achieving specific, more immediate propaganda goals.
Yeah. Less about maintaining ideological purity and more about getting stuff done in the short term.
Now, a really crucial element of propaganda, it seems, is this understanding of the target audience. Like, what do they want? What do they fear? What motivates them? It's not just like blindly broadcasting the message. It's about actually connecting.
Yeah, for sure. Ellul, he emphasizes that good propagandists, they have to understand the needs of their audience, both as individuals and as members of social groups.
Hmm.
He even points out that propaganda can exploit existing private opinions, within a larger public opinion to reverse trends.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's about finding these like little pockets of dissenting views and then using those as leverage to shift the larger opinion.
Exactly. And, he gives this great example of the difference between like personalizing guilt,
Okay.
like saying the French are colonialists,
Mhm.
versus this more impersonal messaging for like confidence, exaltation, like simply saying France is great.
So the approach has to be tailored to the emotional outcome you're going for.
Exactly.
And, at the most basic level, especially in times of war, propaganda is going to tap into that, need for survival.
Of course.
Another really crucial aspect is that, propaganda, it can't go against the grain of, the deeply held beliefs and those societal myths that a population has.
If a propaganda message contradicts what people already believe to be true, it's not going to be effective.
So it's almost like propaganda acts as this kind of psychological mirror, reflecting back the underlying structures of a society.
That's a great way to put it. It reflects, their material conditions, their beliefs, ideas, institutions. It can't really go against that very core.
And Ellul, he touches on how there can be conflicts between the values of local communities and the broader national society. He says that usually effective propaganda will align itself with like the trend that agrees with the dominant myth. Like he uses the example of like racism in the American South versus this myth of progress in the broader US.
Right. Even with that strong local resistance, to racial equality, the broader societal movement, it was fueled by this powerful national myth of progress, justice for all. And that ultimately provided a much stronger foundation for the propaganda pushing for social change.
Okay. So timing also seems to be really crucial.
It is. Explicit propaganda has to be timely. It has to connect with what's currently on people's minds.
It has to resonate.
Exactly. There has to be that resonance between those deep social beliefs and the immediate message if you want people to act.
Okay, so timely news events. He uses this great analogy. They're like the waves you see on the surface of the ocean, but they reflect these, much deeper societal currents underneath.
Yeah, the news grabs our attention, but its lasting power comes from its connection to those deeper beliefs and values.
So, like, an interesting news story is often just showcasing a timely, maybe spectacular aspect of like something that's already deeply embedded in society's reality.
Like the introduction of a new gadget, that embodies the belief in progress, the power of technology.
And then he makes this kind of surprising observation. He says that propaganda actually thrives on the intensity of collective life, regardless of whether that society is integrating or disintegrating. That seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, he's basically saying that during times of heightened intensity, so whether a society is, experiencing unity or fragmentation, people are just more primed to accept propaganda because there's that, elevated level of social energy engagement. They become more susceptible to those psychological pressures, even if they haven't formed, a clearer orientation towards the message itself.
Okay, so it's almost like a more fertile ground. That intensity makes people more receptive, even if that intensity is negative.
Exactly. Now, let's get into this whole issue of propaganda and lies.
Okay, yeah, that's a big one.
So Ellul definitely acknowledges this historical connection. He even references, Norman Ponsonby's book, Falsehood in Wartime.
Right, the whole truth is the first casualty of war kind of thing.
Exactly. But he suggests that modern propaganda, it's become a lot more nuanced than just outright fabrication.
Okay.
He points out that there's a real risk of backlash, loss of trust if those lies are discovered. Goebbels himself, as a master propagandist, he actually used the tactic of exposing past propaganda lies by the Allies to try and discredit them.
Oh, wow. That's pretty clever. So the modern approach you're saying is it's more about carefully choosing which truths to highlight and maybe which inconvenient ones to leave out, rather than just, making stuff up wholesale.
Yeah, exactly. And he mentions that Shafef, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force during World War II, they even had a directive that basically said, tell the truth unless there's a really compelling reason to suppress it, especially if the truth is so unbelievable that it might actually be seen as a lie. And, Mao Zedong, he was also big on factual accuracy. But then Ellul brings in this concept of lying through the manipulation of intentions and interpretations.
Okay, so not falsifying the fact itself, but framing it in a way that suits your agenda. And that's harder to disprove than just a straight-up lie.
Exactly. He gives the example of Hitler, giving all these speeches about peace while secretly building up his military. Later, when war breaks out, he claims he was forced into it. So his peace speeches weren't outright lies, but his intentions were totally hidden.
And it sounds like the perceived probability of a fact becomes really important, too. Like sometimes the truth might be so outlandish that revealing it would actually backfire.
Right. He uses the example of, suppressing the truth about Rommel's absence during Montgomery's victory.
Right.
It was judged to be not probable enough to be told.
Wow. And then he also talks about how propaganda mixes up judgments of fact and judgments of value, like framing enemy bombings as barbaric while portraying your own bombings as necessary.
Exactly. It's all about controlling the narrative.
Okay. Let's circle back to this sociological propaganda idea. Ellul is saying it's not just about changing opinions on specific issues. It's about targeting a whole way of life.
Yeah, much broader, much more powerful form of influence.
So he's saying that things like, medieval Christianity or, more modern American or Chinese cultural influence, that these are all forms of sociological propaganda.
Exactly. It's about the overall environment that subtly pushes a particular ideology and way of being.
So, in a nation that's using sociological propaganda, things like advertising, PR, even entertainment media, they all kind of converge towards a similar underlying message.
It's different from a society with, more diverse, maybe even conflicting intentions. In those societies, these various forces, they tend to reinforce each other, promoting a certain lifestyle.
So the American way of life becoming a global model, and other countries adopting those habits, structures, ideologies.
Yeah, exactly.
And then that makes, American political and economic actions more palatable. Wow. And he's saying that sociological propaganda, it's slower than more direct campaigns, but its aim is much deeper.
Yeah, it's not just about what people think, but how they live, what they value.
But he does say that even, seemingly liberal democracies aren't immune to the potential extremes of this. He points to McCarthyism in the U.S. as an example.
That very diffuse nature of sociological propaganda, it targets those fundamental ideas, those deeply ingrained prejudices, overall lifestyle, and it can actually lead to concrete actions.
Wow. Okay, now let's shift gears and look at this propaganda of agitation and action. So this is the kind of propaganda that governments use after they've already gained power to push through, radical changes.
Yeah, think about Lenin and the Bolsheviks, after the Russian Revolution, trying to overcome resistance from groups like the kulaks.
Right.
Or Hitler implementing these, huge social and economic transformations in Nazi Germany.
Or the Great Leaps Forward in China.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this type of propaganda, it's often directed at internal enemies.
Hmm.
It relies on generating like a state of overexcitement,
Yeah.
demanding maximum energy from people.
Right.
It's about that sense of urgency and mobilizing people for change.
And it seems like it appeals to those really basic, almost primal sentiments like hunger, desire for autonomy, hatred.
Exactly. It bypasses the more nuanced reasoning. It goes straight for those basic human needs and emotions. And unfortunately, that can make people more accepting of lies, if those lies feed the emotional need.
Right.
And it doesn't need sophisticated tools. Simple pamphlets, speeches, even rumors can be effective because the propaganda kind of feeds on itself. The people who are swayed become propagators themselves.
And truth becomes less important than that emotional impact.
Yeah.
Like that example of Patrice Lumumba in Congo, making those claims about the Belgians provoking soldiers without evidence. Now, let's look at integration propaganda. This is about, total molding of the individual, not just temporary excitement.
Yeah, total molding, in-depth. It uses psychological analysis, opinion polling, mass media.
And Ellul is saying this is the more significant type in the modern world, even though, the agitation type gets more attention.
Yeah, because after a group gains power, the long-term goal is to get everyone on board, to make the former opponents into collaborators, and to kind of justify any delays or shortcomings in fulfilling those promises.
Right.
So you see revolutionary movements using, regimentation, indoctrination, to prepare people for this integration.
Right.
Mao called it putting into the mold.
And he says it's easier when you're starting with a pretty homogenous population.
Yeah.
Targeting people with limited education, relying on those simple images, stereotypes, slogans.
Exactly. Now, Ellul makes this really interesting point about information overload.
Okay.
He argues that just like propaganda, the sheer volume of information, especially for non-experts, it provides a broad but very superficial image of the world.
Okay.
But he goes even further. He says that too much data can actually make it harder for us to judge things and form our own opinions. It leads to oversimplification.
But shouldn't having more information lead to better judgment?
Well, his point is that there's a limit to how much we can actually process.
Okay.
When we're bombarded with all this data on all these different topics, we can't deeply engage with it all.
Right.
And so we end up just simplifying things to cope.
So one fact, you understand it. 100 facts about one topic, you get a good idea. But 100 facts about 100 different things, you end up with those simplistic judgments.
Exactly. Like the Russians are terrific, or technology will solve everything. Our brains just reach a saturation point.
Now, let's talk about the historical context that led to, the development of modern propaganda. Ellul points to events like World War I, the Russian Revolution, Hitler's rise, World War II, the post-war Revolutionary Wars, the Cold War.
Each of these events, it pushed the boundaries of propaganda. New methods were developed, deeper understanding.
And he points out that even nations that, hate propaganda, like the U.S. and France, they ended up using it too.
It became a necessary weapon.
Now, Ellul talks about how the isolated individual in modern society, they become really vulnerable to propaganda. And he links this to the decline of traditional social groups.
Like the family, the church. In the 19th century, with individualism on the rise, people, especially in those growing cities, they became more isolated, more uprooted.
So they had this new freedom and responsibility, but it also made them more vulnerable to influence.
Exactly. And Ellul, he references the political scientist Roper, who called a big chunk of the population politically inert, inactive, inattentive, easily manipulated, basically the masses.
Right. And then he contrasts those societies where opinion is shaped by interpersonal relationships with modern mass societies where media has a much bigger role.
In those traditional societies, opinion is formed through those direct interactions. A prevailing view in the community just kind of imposes itself. But mass media, it concentrates influence.
Right.
It allows for like a much more deliberate scientific application of influence methods, whether by the state or, big media companies.
So state-run media or a few powerful organizations controlling the main channels. That creates a really fertile ground for propaganda, like that trend of fewer newspapers, but more readers overall.
Exactly. And it's interesting, Ellul says that this concentration, it's necessary for propaganda, but it doesn't guarantee success. People still have to actually be listening.
Now, he also talks about how socioeconomic factors can limit propaganda's reach.
Mm.
Like, he says that people in extreme poverty, they're hard to reach with integration propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
They're too focused on survival.
Exactly. They're more open to agitation propaganda, though.
Right, the kind that speaks to those immediate needs. And then there's literacy.